Before talking about the effects boarding schools had on local communities, it is very important to discuss what the schools were and what was occurring in the boarding schools for the Native American children. American Indian boarding schools were first established in the United States in late 19th and early 20th century. The main goal was to educate or civilize American Indian children according to the Euro-American standard. Boarding schools were first established by Christian missionaries on reservations for children who didn't have schools nearby. With that being said, many children attending the boarding schools were immersed in Euro-American culture, starting from getting haircuts, forbidding them to speak their native language, and changing their traditional names to a much more Americanized name, in a sense losing their own identity.
It was my first haircut. I cried when I saw my hair on the floor. Tears still well up in my eyes when I remember the way it laid on the floor. Without my Navajo language, I was broken and unable to celebrate my heritage, to express myself. Taking my identity from me made me very powerless.
Just like the woman stated, the loss of her Navajo language made her feel powerless. Of many negative impacts the Native American community were faced with, the loss of language is one that many suffered from. A statement in the text written by Les B. Whitbeck comes straight from one's personal experience with the trauma of this era. Quote, "I don't know how to speak Indian. When I was little, my mother and father didn't speak it to us because they were brought up in boarding schools, and when they went to boarding schools, they were forced to go. They were beaten for speaking their native language at a boarding school." End quote. Populations of Native students in boarding schools reached peak around the 1970s with 60,000 children enrolled. With that being said, there has been lasting effects on local communities after the boarding schools, from loss of culture to mental illnesses and even suicidal thoughts. According to the text, The American Indian Holocaust, Healing Historical Unresolved Grief, boarding schools attempt to assimilate the American Indian people to the white culture. The outcome of these practices have been noted in this text and their severity. Quote, "This phenomenon labeled historical unresolved grief contributes to the current social pathology of high rates of suicide, homicide, domestic violence, child abuse, alcoholism, and other social problems among American Indians." End quote. Additionally, there has been implementation of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, which began in September 2007. The settlement agreement includes the common experience payment to be paid to all eligible former students who resided at a recognized Indian residential school. The settlement agreement also included the independent assessment process as out-of-court process for the resolution of claims of sexual abuse, serious physical abuse, and other wrongful acts suffered at Indian residential schools. This next video clip shows a mother sharing to her daughter the letter she wrote to accompany her application for the common experience payment and how she felt after she left the boarding schools.
To mention something about the common experience, I wrote a letter, right, about my experience and what I went through. All this nonsense. The beating, constant strapping and put downs, and just made my self-confidence. I had to write that down for the lawyer, but when I left that office, I felt really good for once in a long time, because every time I used to think about what I went through at the school, I just couldn't talk or think about it. It just made me cry and cry. But now it's all gone. No more. I may not I'm still the same way, but I can think about it now and just, get on with life.
But I didn't know she felt that way about, feeling better afterwards, so. But to me, it's just a reminder of how, it is difficult to reconcile. And it is difficult to get over the past. You know, we all have these different ways of dealing with the things that have happened, and we're all going through different stages of it. You know, now that she's kind of at this point, like I think I have to get there now because it's still new for me.
Although boarding schools was a horrendous, terrible, horrific thing for Native American children, it is important to look at all perspectives on the subject and not just one single story. It is important to see what were other effects on the local communities from the boarding schools instead of having it all be negative outcomes. One statement found in the text, Native American Boarding Schools by Mary Stout, confirms an open-minded mindset regarding the topic of boarding schools in American Indian history. It states, quote, "Each person who attended boarding school had a different reaction and a different opinion about the process. Many of them figured out who they were at the boarding school and who they were as Indian." End quote. This particular statement is profound in that it reflects a positive energy surrounding the boarding school process. Not to say that the process was right and civil, however, that a lot came out of it and changed the population and community immensely. Furthermore, a different spin on the education of American Indian student is presented in the text, The Phoenix Indian School, Forced Assimilation in Arizona, written by Robert Trennert. Robert Trennert brings light that, quote, "Indian boarding schools were not all evil, and that they failed educationally because the federal government was unwilling to provide adequate support. Although the treatment of students was strict and the system racially segregated, the schools were not as repressive as it often assumed." End quote. This statement is hard to believe when it is counteracted by so many other researchers and authors regarding the negative impact of this educational system on the American Indian people. However, it is interesting to see a different side to the topic and think from a new perspective. Through all the negative backlash of the boarding school catastrophe, one author brings positivity to light in stating, quote, "Some boarding school graduates used their education to become prominent tribal leaders who worked to reinvigorate political sovereignty and straighten traditional cultures on both a local and on a national level." End quote. With all of that being said, our group decided to further investigate what the effects on boarding schools had on local communities by going to the Barona Cultural Center Museum. While we were there, we spoke to a person who was the museum curator and was not an actual resident of the tribe. The first question that we asked the curator was if the boarding schools were affected around this area. This is what she had to say.
The primary boarding school in this area was called the Sherman Institute, or the Paris Institute.
Okay.
Now it still exists.
Really?
It's called the Sherman Indian High School. It's up by Riverside.
I actually saw that. I wasn't sure if that was one because it was the high school. I wasn't. Okay, wow.
It's a high school now. It was a boarding school. We have people on the reservation who went there. Now it's very different experience going to boarding school than it was. Their original reservation, which is actually different than a lot of other places. The original reservation is called Capitan Grande, and it's just in the mountains, kind of right over the hill right there. They, in the early years, they actually had the government sent a teacher to the reservation, and they had a school on the reservation. Now, the kids stopped coming, so they stopped sending the teacher, and it was at that point that really the kids started being sent to the boarding schools. So they were lucky initially because there was a teacher that came to the reservation. It was still a white man, a stranger, but they had somewhere that they could actually learn at home. So, but yeah, the Paris, it's called, Sherman Indian High School is what it's called today. I think it was called the Paris Institute, and that's Perris, Paris, like the city.
The next question we asked was, is there any sort of things that tribes are involved in now as far as making changes to the reservations or fighting for certain things as of today that they are actively engaging within the community? And are they comfortable with public schools for their children after attending boarding schools themselves?
This tribe is very involved in this community and in the outer community. They're incredibly philanthropic, so they give a lot of money to places like the city of Lakeside Chamber of Commerce. El Capitan High School would not exist without Barona. They give a lot of money to the school district because education is very important to this tribe. They also give money to non-federally recognized tribes in this area because there are quite a few in California.
Okay.
And that goes to support, because if you're not federally recognized, you don't have the same rights. You can't have a casino.
Okay,
There's no income, from that sort of thing. So they give to those tribes to help to really keep their cultures alive.
Well, that's very important, because obviously the casino here has helped financially, and then other people don't have that ability, so then they're, I imagine, really below the poverty line or so close to that.
Yes. Yeah. The income from the casino goes to very specific things. It goes to education. So anyone in the tribe who wants to go to college can go to college. Anyone, there's healthcare for the entire reservation. Everyone has healthcare. They take care of the roads. They have tribal enforcement. There's a fire station up here. There's an EMT. It goes to taking care of the elders. We have a circle of elders, and they have activities that they get to do. So all of the money really goes back into the tribe. And then into philanthropy. Okay. So it's not like, it's very specific that what the money goes to.
Overall, to prevent the danger of a single story from schools that are teaching false information about Native Americans, the museum is the current means of communication to expose the cruelty of the past. It can be said that the Native American children who attended boarding schools are still suffering, and organizations such as the Native American Rights Fund pursue strategies to support the healing of boarding school survivors and Native American children, families, communities, and tribal nations. To end this video on a positive note, here are some things that the Native American Rights Fund has done to help heal the Native American people from boarding schools.
Only by bringing it into the light can we begin to heal from it. And that's the first step that we're moving for.
If our tribal cultures are going to stay alive, other than existing as pockets of poverty and sadness, we have to heal. And telling the story, and then help finding resources to turn things around. That's what the coalition wants to do.
The eventual outcomes we would hope would come out of the boarding school healing project would be healing programs that are put together by our own Indian people and their own Indian communities.
We're changing the paradigm of education each day. We're saving the language one child at a time. How do you preserve a language? You create a speaker.
This healing is not just happening on the Native side. It's not just for us that needs to heal over this history. It's also the non-Native community that's really struggling with this healing.
Much more important that we share with our children, that we tell them stories. It's not a very easy thing to do, but be strong. People my age need to be strong and just think about where we've been and teach it to our children.